Good afternoon and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Just recently, a massive Russian drone and missile attack targeted the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and other regions for a second consecutive night, killing at least 12 people and injuring dozens. Despite economic sanctions and international pressure, Russia continues to maintain what some experts call geopolitical dominance along with sustained war efforts. Joining me today to discuss Russia, its geopolitical and economic ambitions is Professor Mark Katz, Professor Emeritus of Government and Politics at George Mason University and a leading expert on Russian affairs. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that how do you view the recent drone and missile strike on Kyiv, especially coming right after the first round of peace talks in Turkey, and what do you think are the strategic implications of this attack?
Yes, well, I think that what's very clear is that Vladimir Putin is not interested in taking up President Trump's idea of a 30-day ceasefire, not at all. That I think he, intends to continue prosecuting the war. So, it just seems that he's not particularly interested in pursuing peace talks at the moment with Ukraine. And so, I think that the President Trump had maybe unrealistic expectations about his ability to persuade Vladimir Putin. And I think that Trump is learning that this is not something he's been able to do.
Yeah. So what exactly does Russia hope to achieve in Ukraine? Is it purely about territorial gains, an ideological battle, economic interests, regional dominance, global messaging, or like a mix of all of these factors?
I think it's pretty much all of these. I think that the minimum is that he he wants to obviously keep the territory he's already captured. I don't think that anyone's going to seriously challenge him on that. The Ukrainians can't really push the Russians out at this point. But Putin also wants the entirety of the four provinces that he's claimed that he's annexed, plus, of course, Crimea. He wants international recognition of this as Ukrainian territory. He may want more Ukrainian territory. It's not exactly clear, but he might be satisfied with these provinces. Even then, the Ukrainians would have to withdraw. And I think that there are other things that he would like. He would like to see a friendlier government to Russia in Ukraine. I don't think he's going to get that. He wants to see limits, if not an end, to Western military support for Ukraine. In other words, the kind of agreement that he wants is one in which essentially leaves Ukraine highly vulnerable to a subsequent Russian attack and puts the West in a position where it doesn't help Ukraine prepare for that.
Yeah. So how has Russia managed to sustain its war efforts despite heavy economic sanctions and international pressure? And do you believe that they can continue at this pace even if faced with more sanctions going forward?
Right. Well, the sanctions, of course, are just basically Western sanctions. In other words, that Russia still trades with China, with India, with the Saudis, the Emiratis, even with Turkey, despite its being a NATO member. So there's lots of room for Russia has had to evade sanctions. In other words, it's the Western sanctions have obviously not helped Russia, but they haven't obviously succeeded in stopping Putin from what he does. And I think the basic thing is that Putin is prepared to make a lot of sacrifices or impose sacrifices on the Russian people for his goals in Ukraine. He's more willing to do this than certainly any Western leader is with regard to what their countries are willing to sacrifice for Ukraine. I think that's what Putin is betting on, that he's more determined than the West is. Now, they understand that the Ukrainians are determined, but obviously, as a population disparity and without Western support, it's not clear how long they can keep up their effort. On the other hand, it does seem that Putin is running into some real economic difficulties going forward. He's become more and more heavily dependent on North Korean arms supplies, and this is really shocking. That a supposedly great power like Russia has to rely on an impoverished state like North Korea. Like many of these missiles, ballistic missiles that have been targeted on Ukraine are apparently from North Korea. So that's not good. And I think it's the question of just how long can he in fact impose sacrifices on his people. He has avoided so far a general conscription. That I think would be highly unpopular. So he's there was a partial conscription early on in the war that was not popular. A lot of people just fled the country. So he's been obviously recruiting in the prisons, recruiting abroad, recruiting from minority groups in Russia, Muslims in particular, and basically once you're in, it's very difficult to get out while one is still alive. Anyway, so it's not easy. In other words, obviously Russia did pretty well last fall, but this year the Russian advance has just been very, very slow, and they've paid thousands of lives for any little advance that they've made. And so the question is just how long can they keep it up? Now, if in fact, Trump's support for Ukraine comes to an end, that would obviously benefit Russia. And I think that Putin has been encouraged by Trump's negative attitude toward Ukraine, by his obvious disinterest in the war. He thought he could solve the war in a day. That didn't occur. He's tried these negotiations, and it doesn't seem to be working out. And so Trump is now threatening to walk away, whatever that means. It's not clear. I think one thing we know about Trump is that he doesn't want to be perceived as a loser, and therefore he does not want to see Ukraine fall while he is president. Certainly, would have been different if it had happened when Biden was president. But when he is president, that he knows that will not look good. But he still has this hope that somehow, Trump and Putin, maybe Trump, Putin, and Xi can make some kind of grand bargain. And I think that the Russians are basically playing him on this. That is just just in today's, I think it was Washington Post was talking about how Trump is fearful of annoying Putin because this would mean that his hopes for improved relationship won't come to fruition. Clearly, Putin is not in the least nervous about offending Trump. So I think that Trump just really has unrealistic expectations when it comes to what he can do with Vladimir Putin.
So where do you see the Ukraine war going forward? Do you believe that in any shorter period of time there would be a sort of a ceasefire or peace talks moving forward, or we can expect continued hostilities across Ukraine?
Well, I think the most likely path forward are continued hostilities, that they will, keep going. And, I think the war is going to be won or lost either. What's going to break first? Western aid to Ukraine or Russian commitment? And it's not like Putin is going to change his mind. In other words, something would have to happen that threatens his own rule in Russia, or maybe ends it altogether, for the Russian side to bring this to an end. I think Putin is even fearful. In other words, that if he agrees to a ceasefire now, what does he do with all these veterans? After the Soviet war with Afghanistan, returning veterans, were a real problem for the Soviet government. And there's a lot more veterans that are going to have to be dealt with from this war with Ukraine, far more. And I think he's worried about what's going to happen. And so I think that in a certain sense, he may feel that he can't afford to end the war, at least not in terms of a ceasefire. It's one never, and then what? But one never knows exactly what he understands. In other words, it appears that he is in a bubble. He doesn't use the internet. The only information he gets is what's supplied to him by his security services, and they don't tell him anything he doesn't want to hear. That would be very dangerous. So his information, I think, is limited. I think that, and therefore he doesn't. He sees himself in a more advantageous situation than he may actually be. But certainly, what he understands from Donald Trump's rhetoric may feed his ideas that he's actually doing well. All he has to do is persist, and that he will eventually win out, and that all the sacrifices will have been worth it, and that that the humiliation of the West will mean it's not just about Ukraine. In other words, that the West will have a far more diminished role in the world. That this will be good for Russia. Now, I think that the real problem, though, is that even if the war ends badly and the West's role is diminished, it's not clear to me that Russia's role is necessarily going to benefit. In other words, that we now have a world in which that the main powers are Russia and China. Are they going to get along? Something tells me that China has interests in Europe, which Russia's hostility toward it really aren't in China's interests. In other words, will China have to somehow rein in Russia? How it would do that? Well, it could just stop trading with it, and that would be the most serious thing that Russia could face. But it's not clear to me. There's this old phrase, when the purpose of an alliance comes to an end, the alliance itself comes to an end. That if the war ends in favorably toward Russia, then I think that differences between Russia and China will suddenly emerge.
Yeah, turning our attention to Syria, which has been a key area of Russian involvement for years. So, how do you view the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and what do you say? Do you say that Russia failed to protect a friendly regime there, and is this a strategic loss for Moscow?
Well, it is. I mean, this was, I think, a major embarrassment. I mean, here they had been supporting Bashar al-Assad for years, and then he just fell. And it's partly Israeli actions, pounding Hezbollah positions, pounding Iranian positions. But if a small country like Israel can do these things that weaken Russia's position in Syria, well, this does not impress the authoritarian rulers in the Middle East. It seems to me that there was whatever they thought of themselves, America's unreliable, but Russia is. But the Russia is dependent on Russian support for Assad. Now, they didn't like Assad, but the fact that he was allowed to fall so unceremoniously, this was not good. And then, Putin turns around and begs the new government, can he keep his bases in Syria? And the new government is at least willing to consider this, even though these Russian bases were used to attack their positions before they came to power. It doesn't make Russia look strong. And I think that, obviously, I think Turkey has benefited tremendously, more than anyone, I think, from this change in Syria. And I think that that's part of the thing that we're actually seeing now, that one of the consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine is Russia is less able to focus on other parts of the world, And we're seeing the rise of certain regional powers, and certainly, I guess we're supposed to say Turkey now is one of those. I don't, and of course we've seen Turkey gaining strength, in the South Caucasus. That they also, what's happening in Libya is less clear to me. They were doing better. Now it's not so clear. But certainly Turkey is doing quite well in Syria. And, to have the Israeli government come out and try to persuade the Americans, oh, let's let the Russians keep their bases in Syria because this will keep the Turkey in check. Well, this is not exactly, a ringing endorsement of Russia's great power status. In other words, it's like, well, Russia is less worse for Israel than Turkey is, or at least that's what the Israelis have convinced themselves of. So I think that there's sort of this narrative is that decline of the West means the rise of countries like Russia, China. Well, I'm not so sure about Russia. That it's. I think that the cost of the war in Ukraine for Russia is that its ability to act as a great power in other parts of the world is diminished, even if they do well in Ukraine.
Yeah. So now coming to Russia's influence in regions like Middle East and Africa, how do you assess its efforts to expand its presence in these areas, and what challenges might it face in maintaining that influence over time?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly in Africa, they've done pretty well, but obviously they have displaced the French in many countries recently, and I guess the Americans as well in Niger. But the governments there, they turned away from the West and toward Russia because they were frustrated that their Islamist opposition wasn't being defeated, that their problems remained and maybe even grew worse. So they get rid of the West, they bring in the Russians. The Russians are tough, whatever. And what we're finding is that the Russians are no more successful in dealing with this Islamist threat. There are some who say their actions have actually made it worse. And so that, I think, is the problem. There's been a lot of there's a misplaced African hope in what the Russians could accomplish. It's not clear to me that they can. I think, as with during the Cold War, often, we used to say the Third World, Soviet influence was strongest in third world countries that were poorest. And I think now as well, Russian influence is strongest in global South countries that are poorest. I'm not sure that that's, what certainly under Brezhnev, what they found was that the allies like this aren't really assets; they're more liabilities than anything else. And I think that that'll be true. Now, the Middle East, I think, is different. In other words, there are countries that are at war with themselves in the Middle East, but there's a lot stronger governments. Whether it's in the Gulf, Turkey, Egypt, certainly Algeria, and they don't need Russian the way that these Sahelian countries need Russia to actually, survive. And a lot of them have money, and so I think that. That they have to wonder, okay, they like the idea that Russia sells weapons to them, no questions asked, not like the West, with its human rights concerns or whatever. Well, now it's not so easy to get Russian weapons because Russia needs the weapons for itself, and also it's just having a harder time producing them, and it's even having to buy weapons, from North Korea and Iran. So I think for a lot of wealthier Middle Eastern governments, that their hopes for Russia have been disillusioned. And certainly with the downfall of Assad, this is not a good advertisement for Russia. In other words, it's like, well, if they couldn't even protect Assad, well, what can they do for us? So
Yeah, so looking ahead, what do you see as the most critical factors that will determine whether Russia can achieve the level of global influence it desires, and what step might Russia take to overcome its current weaknesses or vulnerabilities?
Well, I think in international relations, I think that a lot of uh, one of the biggest factors in determining whether this or that state succeeds is whether its opponents make mistakes. And so I think that that the what Putin has going for him right now, I think, is Donald Trump. That his whole approach to international relations is fairly counterproductive, and that this is, I think, useful for Vladimir Putin. But the trouble, of course, is that Trump is unpredictable. In other words, it's that he can claim he's going to solve a conflict one day, claim he's going to walk away the next day, and if you think that he's completely walked away, well, maybe he'll start sending arms the next day. In other words, it's not predictable exactly what he'll do, and of course, he won't always be president. And I think that's what I think Putin does understand that's whatever agreement he makes with Trump now might not necessarily survive. But I do think that Trump's essentially taking on the entire world. In other words, that like if you have disagreements with everyone, it's not smart to prosecute all these disagreements simultaneously the way that Trump has. He should pick his battles more carefully, and he hasn't. So, I think Putin benefits from that. I think also what Putin is hoping for will be Chinese American tensions going forward. And I don't think Putin will directly side with China. He'll hope to, weave between the two somehow. Um, so there's that. I think that other people's actions are most useful. But for Putin, I think that he is in danger of overestimating his own strength. That you know, how long can they, go on? I think the casualty figures are, one reads are like 1,500 per day. I mean, this is unbelievable. So at a certain point, if he's going to keep this up, he's going to have to start conscripting people in the Moscow, St. Petersburg, who really will not want this at all. And I think that and how long can he rely on the army itself? At some point, do the armed forces decide that the best way to protect Russia as well as themselves is to get rid of Putin? Now, of course, it's easier said than done. But I think that that I think is a real risk for him. That there could be a coup. In other words, it's not so much like a democratic opposition or anything like this. In other words, that the main threat to Putin will come from inside his own regime, from people whom he relies upon now.
Yeah, I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that how do you see other powers like European Union and United Kingdom responding to Russia's influence and responding to Russia's aggression, whether in the
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine or in any other part of the world, including Africa and Middle East?
Right. Well, this is a very good question, and I think that the challenge, Europe and Britain face are twofold. It's not just Putin's hostility, but it's Donald Trump's unreliability as an ally. In other words, that unlike up from World War II up until Trump, when American presidents have seen it very much in America's interest to defend Europe, Trump constantly, questions this, resents this, and so I think that the real question is, I mean, Europe, obviously has the economic strength to be a great power. And I think that there have been, illusions in Europe that somehow, oh, Europe can be a different kind of great power. It can influence the world with its values, etc. It can, induce people to change. I think that I think that Europe can be a great power, but it's going to have to act like other great powers. In other words, it's going to have to organize itself. And I think that the key countries are Britain, France, and Germany. Whether Britain's a member of the EU or not is less important, it seems to me. But these are the three countries. Also, and obviously Poland. I mean, they all play an important role. But I think that without these three, that'd be very difficult for Europe to act as a great power. And I just think that the whole structure of European governance, in other words, that the EU is going to have to be um, change the way it makes decisions. In other words, it's going to have to act more on a majoritarian basis and not on a consensual basis. And that it's going to have to find a way of, if not expelling, at least suspending countries that cooperate or governments that cooperate closely with Moscow. Hungary, Slovakia are the obvious ones. There is Europe cannot afford to allow these people a veto in dealing with the greatest threat that Europe now faces, and that is Russia. So it's a question of can the Europeans? I think they now do recognize the challenge, and they are spending more on defense, but they're going to have to do a lot more. And I think that Europeans, if America took sort of a geopolitical holiday after the end of the Cold War, the Europeans really did. They really thought this was going to be a very different world, and so it's a question of, are Europeans willing to recognize this and to essentially act on their own? And I think one of the things that I believe is that if and when Europe does do this, that European and American are going to differ on a number of issues. In other words, that there's a lot of issues that Europeans have been uncomfortable with American foreign policy in a lot of instances, but have either gone along or not objected too strongly because of their dependence on the U.S. I think that the more Europe becomes a great power in its own right, we're going to see that its differences with the U.S. Come to the fore. And I think foremost among those will be the question of Palestine, will be one of them. That Europeans simply do not see Israel in the same light as the Americans do. And we may see this, in other parts of the world too, that there's just, that we're going to, in other words, for Trump, the idea is that the Europeans are taking advantage of America, therefore they should pay more on themselves. Okay, that's fine if you really want to think that, but we have gotten something in return for this dependence, and that is essentially European acquiescence into a lot of American foreign policies that really weren't in European interest necessarily. That, I think, is going to end. And I don't think Trump or his supporters have a clue about what that actually means.
Yeah, before we conclude the discussion, I would like to quickly ask your opinion about Turkey, because on one hand, they enjoy good relations with Moscow, and on the other, they are a NATO member state. So how do you see the role of Turkey, and does other European Union member states and other NATO states are having a conversation with Turkey on these double standards?
Yes, well, I think that states are notorious for doing double standards. I think essentially, I think Turkey is pursuing what it sees as its own interests, and obviously we're unhappy about their interactions with Russia. On the other hand, the Russians aren't so happy about Turkey thwarting them in Syria, in the South Caucasus, competes with them in Africa. I just think that basically Turkey really is less and less part of Europe and is acting as a regional great power on its own. And so I think that the question simply is, well, who are we better off with? In other words, is Turkey's actions, do they hurt us more, or do their actions hurt Russia more? And to the extent that they hurt Russia more, then probably they're just going to have to be tolerated. And what's interesting is that Donald Trump seems to have a visceral understanding of that. In other words, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to recruit Trump to see Turkey as the Islamist adversary that he sees it as, and Trump has basically just ignored him on this. Similarly, with Trump's desire to have a nuclear agreement with Iran, that so I think that is now, and if Trump does this with Turkey, I suspect that the Europeans will as well. In other words, that they're not going to be more supportive of Israel than Trump, for example. So I just think that we all have to think of Turkey as a regional great power, and that it's a NATO member. Maybe it's not always acting in the way NATO would like, but what will be the consequences of its withdrawal from NATO? Do we really want to see that? So it's like some cooperation is better than none, and so I just think that it's we're entering a very different world than we had before.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Katz, for sharing your valuable insights on Russia's evolving geopolitical ambitions and its role in global affairs. We sincerely hope this conversation has offered clarity on some of the key questions shaping today's international landscape. Once again, thank you so much for joining.
And thank you for having me once again on the Prode.
Thank you so much.